We now come to the second game in this series on the classical Dutch defense that I'm going to take a look at. I'm going to use most of my own games just because I have more knowledge of what's going on if I use my own games. And of course, my opponents in each of these games are extremely strong players. They're all 2,700 plus opponents. The person I'm facing here, well, I'm facing Alexei Shirov. Now, Shirov is one of my favorite players of all time. He's an absolute crazy, mad hacker attacker. And I've played Shirov now three times, each time with the black pieces, and I've scored 0 out of 3. So he's got the better of me, but he's a much better player than me. But he's such a great player. He always tries to come and attack you. He always plays very aggressive chess, and his attacking play is just real joy to watch. So whenever I play Shirov, I always get very excited, and I always find it quite an occasion. Now, in my other games, when I've played Shirov for Black, he's always played E4, and I think after this game, he said something along the lines of, "I'm always going to stick to E4 in future against you," just because he played into my classical Dutch in this game. But even though I lost the game, it clearly wasn't the fault of the opening, and I probably just had a nice advantage from the opening. So let's go through the opening moves again. I'll try to explain them bit by bit. So we had a look at the ideas in the Wojciech game previously, but I will try to enforce some of the main ideas as we go along here. So D4 was played. Now, F5 is the normal way of entering into the Dutch defense, as we mentioned before. The way I normally prefer to enter the opening is by E6, because I played a French defense. Now, I think this move order will generally work quite well, but you might have to have some knowledge of what to do after the move E4, D5. Obviously, that's a completely new opening, a French defense opening. But most players who start with one D4 don't really want to play into an E4 opening. So here, my opponent now plays C4. And this is a slightly different move order to the Wojciech game. But again, your setup of black is the same. As black, classical Dutch, your first moves are F5, knight to F6, bishop to E7, castles kingside, D6. This is generally always the way you start the game with black. So just remember to get these moves in. Pay attention to what your opponent's playing. But what we're concentrating on these 5 videos is the setup where white fianchettos his bishop to G2. So obviously, if your opponent plays something else here, you might have to adapt your setup to that, whatever your opponent's doing. But if your opponent sets up with bishop to G2, generally just stick with his plan of development. Okay, so here I played F5, so entering into my classical Dutch. G3, so my opponent plays along the lines I'm used to, and now we go through the motions of knight F6, bishop E7, castles. So bishop G2, bishop E7, knight to F3, castles. So we have now reached the same position I had against Wojciech from a slightly different move order from white's though. My opponent now castled, and now the classical Dutch starts with the move D6. Now let's just try to talk about the pros and the advantages of playing D6 again. Well, the main advantages is to try to play E5 later on, and then F4. This is the pawn structure you're aiming for. E5 and F4 starting an attack. So this is why the pawn here supports the move E5. Now your position may look a bit cramped here, but it has a lot of potential. Okay, now the pieces you generally want to move in this start of the game is the knight on F6. This comes to E4, as we'll see in the game. The bishop on E7 comes to F6. And the queen on D8 comes often to H5. Sometimes you combine this with the move A5, controlling the B4 square, but you rarely in this opening position, it's worth pointing this out, rarely do you actually develop your bishop on C8 until much later on in the game. Your bishop on C8 can happily sit on that square. I mean, really, you want to try to develop your bishop on C8 to H3, believe it or not. That might sound absolutely ridiculous because there are 2 pawns in the way here on E6 and F5. But once these pawns move, your bishop wants to come flying out to the H3 square to start an attack. So that's your general idea here. Okay, now Shirov, in the last game, Wojciech played queen to C2. Shirov now played what I'd say the most normal move is knight to c3, developing his knight. And here, well, unlike the game against Wojciech, knight to c6 is something you want to avoid playing here, really, because if you play this move too soon, you run into d5. And this destroys your pawn structure. Now, you always want to meet the move d5 with the move e5. And here, this is not possible because your knight on c6 has been attacked. Let's say, for example, once you move your knight, there's not really any good squares, but let's say you move your knight back to b8, for example. Well, if it is your move here, you play e5, but your opponent now has time to do something like either knight to d4 or pawn takes e6. And both these moves I find quite unpleasant for black because now your pawn structure has been a bit destroyed and you can no longer play the move e5 here. So this is something you have to try to bear in mind and avoid falling into. Now, the move I'm going to recommend in this position is the move knight to e4. And this looks like the best move here and a move I've had a lot of success with. In this position, it's most likely your opponent will play queen to c2. This is the move that nearly everyone plays. Now, quickly, just very briefly, I'll just show you one line which will happen if your opponent doesn't play this and, for example, takes on e4. Now, originally, I thought this was a bit worrying for black's setup, but I think this is now okay as long as you play pawn takes e4. So now the white knight on f3 has to move. I think d2 is the best square. Now we continue with d5. There's a fair bit of work on this. I recommend you look at some of my other games to have a deeper look at this, but generally your ideas here are some moves like knight to c6, bishop to f6, and sometimes even c5. As long as you remember to play aggressively, you have to play very aggressively in this type of position, you should get an okay game. But let's see how Shirov dealt with this opening, because of course Shirov is a great attacking player, and this again, this game, it goes along the attacking theme, and we can see when Shirov starts the attack against me. So it's really combining the opening play, this Dutch defense, with attacking chess. So hopefully you're getting two lessons of one here. Well, my opponent here now played the more common move, queen to c2. And this is what most players with the white pieces will play, increasing the pressure on the e4 square. So now my knight on e4 has to make a decision. Now, you should always take on c3. And again, white has a decision to make here. My opponent played the rather risky b takes c3. Now, first of all, let's have a look at what happens if he plays queen takes c3. This looks like a much more natural move to not double the white pawns. But, of course, Shirov, being a very dynamic player, doesn't necessarily worry about considerations like double pawns. Now, queen takes c3 is more natural, and my opponent now wants to play b4, so we play another standard move here, pawn to a5, and this controls the b4 square here. And now, the plan now, this is one position which I think you could get a lot of time, so I'm just going to mention the plan that you need to play in this position. This is one reason why you've moved the knight on f6 away from the f6 square. Now, the one reason you move that knight away from f6 is to put your bishop on f6. And your one plan here, the only plan you need to remember, is bishop to f6, knight to c6 at the right moment, obviously, e5. This is your main idea. And once you can achieve this, you get a very good position. For example, let's say white plays some normal moves, b3. Bishop to f6, stage 1 of the plan. Bishop b2, knight to c6, stage 2 of the plan. Now, a crafty move like rook on ad1. If you go e5 straight away, well, that would allow white to take on e5, and now your pawn cannot capture because your queen's on pre. So that's a crafty move, rook ad1, but all we do to avoid that is go queen e8. Sticking to the same plan as before, the queen has potential over here, and we want to go e5. And after some move like e3, we can play e5 with a good attacking position. So this is what you're aiming for, really, when you play this opening, the move e5. So let's go all the way back to where I go knight to e4. And we'll just try to mention why I think knight to e4 is a good move. Well, number one, a little bit of advice to you here. If you've got a more cramped position, and black does have a more cramped position when he plays classical Dutch, it's a good idea to exchange pieces off because that relieves the crampedness of your position. And by playing knight to e4 in this position, we're exchanging pieces off. We're making the position less cramped. So this is a very good plan. And the other main move, the other main idea is to give the f6 squared for our bishop. Okay, back to the game. Queen to c2 was played. And now I took on c3. My opponent took with his b pawn here. So b takes c3 is a very natural move to play here. And yeah, well, we've just looked at the other possibilities here. I mean, b takes c3 has one main idea in mind here. White wants to try to play e4. Now, as a rule, I mentioned this before, when your opponent plays e4, you never want to capture on the e4 square. This is bad. For example, if I play something like a5, then e4, capture, capture. White's clearly better because of the weakness against e6. So this is to be avoided. So what you want to do when you want to meet e4 to break e5, you have to play knight to c6 here, because if you don't play this move, knight to c6, you won't be able to meet e4 with e5. So knight to c6 is a very good move. Now, my opponent did continue with e4 here. It's worth mentioning here that if he goes d5, the move we generally worried about, then we go knight to a5 here. And now that white has doubled his c-pawns, this is not so bad for us. For example, we don't have to always go for the e5 move. Okay, it'd be great if we get it in, but we can play against our opponent's double pawns. So in this particular case, we can allow the move d5. Instead, my opponent played e4, which of course looks like the most logical move here. And how do you meet e4? We need to meet it with the move e5. And now my opponent played similar to Wojciech. He swapped off an e5, opening the d file. But instead now he played rook to b1. And this is a critical moment of the game. And I'm sure if Shirov was playing with the black pieces here, he'd win against most players in the world. Now, pros and cons of the position. White has two open lines, the d file and the b file. But I still have my standard attacking the plan, as we saw in the last game. Queen e8, queen h5, and now either f4 or f takes e4. This is your standard attacking plan here. It's worth noting in this game that f4 is a very strong possibility here as well, just to try to attack like that. So there's a number of strong attacking ideas for black here. Now, as I was playing Shirov, I got a bit overly worried here. And this again comes back to attacking in chess. Sometimes you just need to get on with the attack. And here I saw my opponent's idea was to come rook b5. So I played the prophylactic move a6 here, which we'll come on to very shortly. Now, I think a much more interesting idea would have been f4 here, just trying to push through on the king side. And we could even go caveman style with g5 if we really want to. This would have been a much more interesting idea and something which I'd play in the future. Okay, but let's have a look. So in the end, I played a6, stopping my opponent's plan, which maybe is not such a bad move. My opponent now played rook to d1. That's fine, because I can get on with my plan or bring my queen to h5. Queen e8, and now rook to d5. And here, this is where Shirov starts to take control of the game. Okay, he's pressurizing e5 here. And this moment I played a big mistake. I played bishop to e6, allowing Shirov to play a brilliant sacrifice. Now, before we move on to that idea, let's just have a look at what I should have played. I should have just controlled the e5 square with bishop to f6. And here I think black is just better, believe it or not. For example, bishop to a3, just rook to f7. If my opponent takes on f5, which looks like he's won a pawn, now I have to aim to take back this pawn with my bishop, and I can do that by playing bishop to e7. And the point being, I have bishop takes f5 flying in the game, and my pieces are very active. So this would have been a perfectly good position for me. But I got a bit greedy against Shirov, and one thing you should never do against Shirov is get greedy. Shirov loves sacrificing pieces, so getting greedy was just really stupid here. And I played bishop to e6. And like I said, this allows Shirov to sacrifice. Not a good idea. I don't know what I was expecting now. I mean, it was very strange. I could not have been expecting my opponent to retreat his rook, because that would have been just a waste of time for him. And now my opponent plays a brilliant strategy on the light squares. And I think this is very thematic to how Shirov plays the rest of the game. Certainly not the opening's fault here, but Shirov exploits my light squares very well here by playing a brilliant exchange sacrifice. He plays rook takes b7. And this is a brilliant idea. I'm now forced to take his rook on d5, and now c takes d5. And what does my opponent gain from this? Well, my light square bishop, which was on c8, was actually a key defender to my position, because a lot of the time it's coming to f5 and getting into the game via light squares. Now it's gone from the board. My opponent has a light square bishop, which becomes such a strong piece. This bishop on g2 can come into g6, can come into the game from a number of angles. My opponent has one pawn for the exchange, but my position is creaking somewhat. And my pieces are now forced to worse squares. So all this is involved from my opponent's very good exchange sacrifice he started. So knight to a5, I have to try to play aggressively. Rook to b1, just simply retreats. If he takes on c7 here, then his rook will get trapped with something like bishop to d6, and he can't lose two exchanges. Crazy. So in this position, he goes rook to b1, and now I played knight to c4. And here, my opponent just took on f5 with 2 pawns for the exchange. But his light square domination is a joy to watch. His pawns are on light squares. He wants to put his bishop on a light square. And just watch how he dominates the light squares, and the exchange sacrifice works perfectly. I have to try to play a bit passively here. My dark square bishop is a bad piece. There's another thing that plays an important role in the game. And now Shirov just simply exchanges off my one active piece. And this is very good attacking idea. Anyway, when you're attacking, you still need to think strategically. And here Shirov's just thinking, well, the knight on c4 is an attacking piece. If I swap this knight off, I've increased my advantages in my position. I decided to keep this knight on the board, knight d6, but now Shirov uses his pawn majority of the d pawn and c pawn. And as soon as his d pawn moves as well, his bishop gets even more scope along the diagonal. Now, the rest of the game maybe not so important, but it's nice to see how Shirov played. Okay, I've got my queen h5 in, but it has no backup now, because you're not going to checkmate your opponent just with one piece. I needed a bishop on c8 to attack and a knight on f6 to attack. Here, I don't have any backup, so it's clearly going to fail. Okay, so c5 was played. I now tried to take on f5 for my queen, but my opponent, who's a great calculator of the game, had calculated the following variation. Takes d6, attacking my rook on a8. I really don't think I can move this rook anywhere because his pawns are just becoming too strong. But again, look at his light square ideas here. This light square bishop, such a strong piece. So I gave up the exchange, but this gave me little joy. A very good check for the endgame, forced my king to a worse square. And we had a number of exchanges. My opponent kept playing aggressively, and as soon as he took on d6, his pawn proved to be too strong. We'll just see a couple more moves. King to f1, d pawn, far too strong. Pieces get exchanged, but my king was in back rank trouble, and here it's clear to see his d pawn's going to win the game. So a very nice game by Shirov. Not any fault of the openings there. Let's just go and have a look at the key moments. So again, we continue with our standard play of going knight to f3, d6, and knight to e4. So this is all kind of, this knight to e4 move is my recommended way of playing against knight to c3. So this is my suggested move here, to give your f6 square for the bishop and to try to really uncramp your position and get e5 in. So an interesting game, I thought. Nice exchange sacrifice from Shirov, but again, this just shows you in this game more ideas in the classical Dutch and the idea of this knight to e4 move being successful. So hopefully that will help you understand Dutch a little bit more. We've got 3 more videos coming in the same series, and by then, hopefully, you're ready to be brave enough to play the Dutch in one of your own games.